Hello and welcome to the
I watched the Russian.
my opinion, one of the Hello and welcome to the newest episode of the Brussels Signal Horizon podcast. It's with great pleasure that I can welcome back on the show Michael Avery. Now, Michael will already be very frustrated because I already welcomed him back 3 weeks ago, but somehow I managed to mess up the recording, so I had to re-invite him to redo the last podcast. And the fact that he's doing all of this for free makes me even more embarrassed. But Michael, so glad to have you back.
Look, I'm very happy to be here always. And actually, so much has happened since we spoke 3 weeks ago that I think it was worth doing a new podcast anyway.
I was thinking exactly the same thing. So today, the time of recording is Sunday, November 24th in Austria and Monday, November 25th in Asia, where you are. So there are so many questions. So from your perspective, what has kept you awake over the last couple of hours? What are you observing with a particular keen interest?
Well, besides preparing for this podcast, of course, which always always has me getting mentally sharp. Clearly, I think the major talking point is the sudden turnaround that we're seeing on the Russia-Ukraine front vis-a-vis the floated US plan, the 28-point plan, which I dubbed 28 points later in my initial very snapshot coverage of it. Now, when I first saw it, truth be told, which was of course last week, I initially dismissed it just because I thought, okay, well, these kind of things have come and gone several times. We can see what the grinding dynamic is there between Russia and Ukraine. And then, of course, joining dots, it became very clear, after a couple of conversations, that the corruption charges against Zelensky were, it would appear, real enough to actually get Ukraine to maybe sign up to something that they didn't otherwise want to sign up to. Let's just leave it at that without getting into the really long grass. And as soon as one grasped that was the case and that this was really going to be pushed hard by both sides, by the US side and of course by Russia, then you started to realize that actually it could happen. And if it did, while we have of course seen, according to something you just shared with me, 2 European counteroffers. When I went to sleep last night, it was 1 European counteroffer, which is basically nothing that the US says goes. And another one now which appears to move very much along the same track as the US, but with somewhat softer edges. We can see that something is likely to happen on that front. And if we consider it to be a spectrum of possible outcomes from where we are now to, at the far end, the 28-point plan that the US initially drafted, it seems to me very difficult to get political momentum going now to move back towards where we are now, vis-a-vis that 28-point plan. So something along those lines looks like it could, and I still stress could, it could be happening pretty fast, which changes a lot, both in Europe and globally.
Do you have any inkling as why all of a sudden over the last couple of days there was so much movement, or what appears to be quite significant movement? Did something happen, or is it a change in strategy on part of the United States, or do you think what happened, or was it just about time?
Well, as I said, I think part of it is that there was that political window of opportunity vis-a-vis all the corruption scandals swirling around Zelensky, which have really weakened him, and that can't be discounted. And clearly that, I think, is being used in the background. But above and beyond that, and this is why this particular role as global strategist is so tiring, it conflates as an integral part with so many other moving parts within this grand macro strategy standoff between the US and China. Because Trump is under more pressure domestically, particularly after the bad election results that he got a few weeks back, where he really needs to focus on affordability as much as possible. And at the same time as he's doing that, he's got a very, very, well, it remains to be seen how large, but there's a threat emerging on the far right of the Republican Party, which is much more isolationist, much more interventionist, much more anti-war. And he needs to address that. And additionally, he's still got the struggles with China, with rare earths. He's still trying to remake the global trading system, where we have the Supreme Court about to make a decision on whether this iteration of tariffs do or don't hold up before he has to pivot to others, potentially. And then, of course, he's also got to try and get something done domestically in terms of reshaping the Federal Reserve, which he's, again, being tied up in court over. But we expect within the next few weeks, he may float a shadow Fed chair. That's what they're talking about, who would then take over from Powell at some point next year. And all of these mechanisms, whether it's the Fed in particular, whether it's an attempt to try and get the economy jump-started, whether it's an attempt to try and address affordability, whether it's an attempt to try and look at the national security struggles vis-a-vis rare earths and reindustrialization, whether it's a need to pivot to Asia vis-a-vis China, and whether it's a need to reset allies and what they can expect the US will or won't do. They all run through Ukraine to an extent. And so I think from a Trump perspective, and it's quite logical, and maybe I didn't unpack it as fully as I could have, but if you look at it in real detail, all of these things need to be done at once. They can't be done sequentially, which is the way that most journalists and most analysts would rather they were done. Because if they're done sequentially, we can all talk about one and then the next and then the next. But they're all going to be done together, or they're not going to be done at all, I suspect.
I mean, I'm wondering if you would put yourself, or if we put ourselves in the shoes of Vladimir Putin. I mean, at this point, you alluded to the domestic political issues in the United States. I think we could talk about similar issues in Europe, right? I mean, there seems to be, I wouldn't call them pro-Russia parties, but let's say more isolationist-minded parties in Europe seem to be on the rise, or parties that would push for a peace almost at any cost. So if I would be Vladimir Putin, wouldn't I just wait it out and say, okay, there are midterms next year, so Donald Trump will have to focus more and more on domestic policies, including what you just mentioned, the affordability issue. There are parties on the rise in Europe, from the AfD to Le Pen and other parties that are, as I said, I don't think they are pro-Russian, but they are definitely pro-ending the conflict or freezing the conflict at any cost necessary. So why not just wait and from time to time act as if you would be willing to enter in a ceasefire, enter into negotiations, and thereby actually stoking the fires of divisions. Because then people always say, well, look, the Russians, they were willing, they entered negotiations, and then we ruined it, or the deep state, or the neocons, or whatever terms that are flying around. So do you think from a strategic viewpoint, but also from an honesty viewpoint, that Russia is really ready or willing to enter into serious negotiations about ending the war?
Well, first of all, we have to wait and see. That's the really cowardly answer to give you. I think the Russian strategy of just trying to grind this out at terrible cost, of course, to itself as well as others, was clear. And I think if you look at the rising momentum in Europe, at least, you could say that the political winds, were behind it rather than running or blowing into it. But it is under pressure too. I mean, particularly we had just seen Ukraine strike a major power station just outside Moscow Oblast before I retired last night. And those kind of pressures are real too. It's not as if the Russian economy is not in some kind of trouble. I mean, for example, they're about to raise VAT by 2 percentage points in January because they are really running out of cash to do this. And the Soviet era military stock is largely depleted, so they can't just keep getting old stuff, out of the storeroom that's been mothballed and using that up. They will need to actually start producing much, much more. So it's not as if they're not feeling the strain. But I think more of the momentum for this actually comes from the US side. As I said, that they suddenly see, look, we need to get all these ducks lined up and we need to get them all sorted out. So we will address our populist issue domestically. We get another foreign policy win. Whether it holds up or not in the long run, as we see in the Middle East, is a different question. But for the short term, we can say, hey, we've resolved this particular issue. We hand the keys to Europe and say, if you don't like it, fine. You buy the car off of us and you drive the car if you don't like the way it's been driven so far. Certainly Europe has to step up and do a great deal more than it's been doing so far, despite the fact it thinks it's been doing a lot. And equally, it frees the US to then focus on the fact that, for example, in Latin America, we still have rumbling issues over Venezuela, which of course would be a key plank in any Monroe/Donroe doctrine. And we have headlines flashing around again this morning as I wake up here, underlining just how tense the situation is becoming between Japan and China over Taiwan. And Japan is about to move missiles to a Japanese island right next to Taiwan, which will of course really infuriate China, and underlining just how the US needs to be able to pivot in that direction rather than focusing on Europe. So we have all of these things together, and I said the economy very much in the background too. And I think from the US perspective, it looks like they think this is a propitious time to try and strike and get all these things done at once. But whether Russia will adhere to that in the longer term, well, that's the $64 million question. And that, in a way, you have to pivot back to Europe and ask, look, if this gets agreed by the end of this week, I mean, the time frame is apparently the US wants it done for Thanksgiving, so on Thursday. So if this gets done, ostensibly, a document has been signed ending the war between Ukraine and Russia, ostensibly. We can see it finlandizes Ukraine, of course, but ostensibly, hostilities have ceased. Russia pledges never to invade Europe. I wonder, all I'm doing is floating here, right? I don't have the authority to speak for any country in Europe, let alone for all of Europe. But I wonder what the political dynamic in Europe looks like. Does Europe then say we will continue to spend 5% of GDP on defense and transform our economies at, really significant cost to ourselves in different dimensions into lean, mean fighting machines? Will we do that? Or will we say, hey, peace in our time? And immediately say, right, either tax cuts or more social spending it is. And if that happens, then what's the US reaction, given that they've already made it very clear what they expect NATO to be doing? And I only ask that because you can already see Spain in particular is refusing to go along right now. And I wonder if any other countries would jump on the bandwagon, particularly in the west of Europe, if ostensibly the East is told, look, don't worry about it, the war is over, right?
I mean, is it possible that the United States are indeed playing something akin to 4D chess here? You mentioned Latin America. I think there's a lot going on there which is underreported in European media. So one of the reasons, I mean, there can always be more than one reason, but I think one of the reasons why the United States all of a sudden so engaged with the cartels, particularly in Mexico, is because the Mexican cartels are deeply embedded also in the Mexican resource trade. That the cartels have been sluicing off resources from Pemex and have been a problem within Mexican fossil fuel production is more or less an open secret. You mentioned Venezuela. I think Venezuela currently barely produces 1 million barrel per day. I think at their best time they were producing 4 million barrel a day. So I guess they could get back to this. We saw also what was happening in Argentina. So that the American strategy is a medium to long term one where they say we try to freeze, if you want, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but at the same time we're going to open the spigots. We go so massively into energy production that the prices for oil and gas collapse, and then more or less the main source of revenue for Russia will fall so significantly in its value that they will no longer be capable to fight a war, even if they would want to. So that around the corner, so to speak, that they would weaken Russia, and at the same point, lower energy prices could also benefit the Europeans. So in a kind of certain way, you could strengthen your allies and you could weaken your enemy. It would take a little longer maybe, but they say let's just play for time, and then this problem could resolve itself.
Well, yes, I agree with that. Let me add a few things. I think it goes beyond that because, of course, the lower energy prices help Trump domestically with the midterms looming next year, very much. You can also be incredibly cynical here, and you can say that lower fossil fuel prices, were that to occur, also disincentivize Green New Deals because the trade-off suddenly becomes that much more problematic. It's that much cheaper just to rely on fossil fuels, and of course the US backs that particular angle rather than the European green one. Okay, so that's an additional benefit. And if you do have Latin America as your Monroe Doctrine base in the Western Hemisphere, one other thing to consider is that over the longer term, and this would be difficult to do, so I want to make it clear this isn't something that's just a quick jump away. It's a serious issue to get there. But logistically, you can make a case that you can start to look at the US being able to lock in energy within the Western Hemisphere. Give or take, as I said, some changes that need to happen in refineries, etc. Russia has got low energy prices, which, as you said, keeps that down. Iran has low energy prices, which keeps that down too. Now, China, of course, benefits from having low energy prices on paper. But actually, if you've managed to control fossil fuels in the Western Hemisphere so that they flow to you quite nicely, thank you very much, and you're an exporter of LNG to others, which you remain, thank you very much, you are much better placed, if you wanted to disrupt energy flows elsewhere in the world so that you have cheap energy but that other people don't. And I'll leave it at that, but I think you can probably join some of the dots that I'm alluding to. That would be a potential aspect of this. And one other one, I'm just going to throw it into the mix. And I'm not saying that you have to go along with it at all. It's just a hypothetical. When we're discussing this, quite correctly, most of the time, we presume that we're talking about closed loop national entities, the US, Russia, China, well, Europe being the obvious example. We know when we talk about Europe that, we're talking about dozens of voices and dozens of voices inside each of those dozens of voices. Obviously, we know in the US that we've got Republicans and Democrats, and you know that they're opposed to each other on many things. But I think it is important to remember that above and beyond those traditional political splits, you do have different power bases in different institutions and different power groups. I mean, in a very crude sense, you can talk about the state versus the deep state in some countries, and we do certainly in some, and we don't in others. But that doesn't mean it isn't true. And I think aspects of this particular policy that are playing out can also reflect, to varying extents, intra-group clashes. And I'm looking at Mexico in particular there, between who is in control and who isn't, and who would like to be and who isn't. And that's an additional complication. And again, journalists are going to hate talking about it because it really muddies the waters. It's not so easy to move the pieces on the chessboard when you don't know, which pawn is for which team, or if there's a green and a blue team as well as a black and a white set, on the board. But that's also possible.
And it seems likely. I mean, I'm not saying that the United States would prefer regime change in Mexico, but I think they wouldn't be opposed to it. Because the consolidation, let's call it, of the Western Hemisphere is underway, but it is definitely not yet concluded. And also what you mentioned regarding China is, I think, if I got my numbers correct, China is not only the world's largest consumer of coal, they're also using more coal to use processes to produce diesel and other fuels from coal than any other country is burning coal for energy needs. So basically, China is the number one user of coal for electricity production, but they're also the number one user of coal for these processes of turning hard coal into liquid fuels. So it seems that China is preparing for the scenario for the potential scenario that you have been describing.
No, absolutely. I mean, look, China, as we know, plays the economic statecraft game better than anybody. And they have done for a very long time, and you have to take your hat off to that. Yes, I mean, they're using an old technique which, Germany was playing around with in the early 20th century to try and get around the strategic weakness they have, which is no oil. And so from the US perspective, you can't do much about that per se, but you can start to strengthen your own position to at least, as I said, make sure that in any game plan, you have cheap commodities and the other side has more expensive ones, which again is exactly what we see with rare earths, for example. They're cheap in China. Their Chinese products are cheaper than anyone else's in the West, but they're much more expensive in the West than they are in China. And that's the way China would like to keep it. I mean, that's a very, very clever strategy. And again, one has to applaud when one looks at how it was carried out. As a theoretician of how these things can work, one should. But the US response now and the Western response is interesting in a way, and I'm pivoting just slightly here, but they're now talking about tariffs, which we're seeing, subsidies, which I've always said would have to go hand in hand with that, and price controls. They're now talking about setting a price floor for these things to incentivize production of them. Yet the irony is then, of course, that means that you're just producing something that's vastly more expensive than the opposition. So it ripples down your entire supply chain. So it's a very, very long-term, painful, expensive way of getting out of it. And if you can force that back on other people somehow, in terms of other commodities, you know just how powerful that weapon is.
Do you think that China has played its cards, or maybe the wrong term is to say that they played its cards well, but it showed that it has a significant number of cards? When you think about the whole Imperial drama, maybe we can talk about this a little bit, but also in the area of rare earth. I mean, China does have leverage, and sometimes it appears to me that Western commentators and Western politicians have maybe not underestimated that the leverage exists, but it seems to me they underestimated the willingness of China to use that leverage, and they have at least credibly indicated, I mean, that they have not yet pulled the lever to the fullest extent, but they showed that they could if they're willing to, and they were absolutely ready to inflict some pain and say that we don't just have the leverage, we are also willing to use it.
Well, yes, I mean, let's start with the willingness. That should be abundantly clear. I mean, we're seeing now in the China-Japan standoff that they've already said, right, tourism to Japan should cease and we won't buy seafood. I mean, they're starting with relatively small things, but they are threatening to go all the way to rare earths. And if they cut off rare earths to Japan over this, when the US has already purportedly signed that agreement saying that the US and everybody gets rare earths, then it's very clear that once again, this deal is no real deal. And as soon as you do anything China doesn't like, you can't get the input which is necessary for everything that you want to make. So that would, again, change the entire global paradigm. People should be fully cognizant of that dynamic in China. In terms of the cards being held, you have two extreme views. On one hand, you have these people who say that, China has all the cards, the West has already lost. Why aren't we learning Chinese right now? Why aren't we having this podcast in Chinese? I mean, you do get an extreme view like that, which is frankly silly. And then you have the other one, which is, it used to be a triumphalist Western view. That's obviously disappeared because there's nothing to be triumphalist about in the West now. But they still say, well, look, China is absolutely reliant on the West because, for example, they sell all their products to us. Now, look, there's some truth in that, absolutely. If you are exporting a lot and you need the Western market, to keep people employed, yeah, sure, there is a codependency there, which you can't ignore. But equally, it's incredibly naive, and I've run across this all the time, to think that therefore that puts us in a strong position, the West. Absolutely it doesn't. If you are the one who's reliant on all inputs from China, whether they're, soft inputs, shall we say, like novelty toilet roll holders or consumer goods, or whether they're hard ones, like rare earths, ultimately it shows you just can't do any of those things yourself. And therefore the other side, besides the balance sheet argument that they're running the trade surplus, you're running the trade deficit, ergo over time they build up claims on your economy. They gradually own your economy bit by bit, whether it's via debt or FDI, etc. That's just how balance sheets work. And history is replete with examples of this between allies and not so allied countries. They are in a position where at any point they can just say, referring back to that will, okay, now you don't get that. And in what way does that really help us to be able to say, well, that hurts you too? So they'll say, yeah, and we don't care. We're quite prepared. We're quite prepared to have that pain. It'll hurt you more. We don't win that game.
They showed this with the whole Nexperia drama, right? For those of your viewers and listeners who haven't heard about it, I think Nexperia was a Dutch chip maker, not the high-end chips, but very basic chips that are needed in cars and other appliances. And I think based on a law from 1972, the Dutch government nationalized the company, or basically kicked out the Chinese CEO because it was bought by China before. But as it then turned out, Nexperia usually then, I think they export parts of the chips to China where they are completed, and then they re-export them back to Europe. And the Chinese said, fine, if you are nationalizing our Chinese subsidiary in the Netherlands, then we are going to nationalize your subsidiary in China, and we will not re-export those chips. And I think for 2 weeks, or was it 1 week, Volkswagen was not able of delivering their cars because they were missing those basic chips. So this was if this was a battle in a larger trade war, is it fair to say that in this case, at least, the Chinese showed that they are that they have more leverage? And I think what now happened is that actually the Dutch government handed the company back to the Chinese.
Yeah, yes. In summary, you're correct. And on one hand, again, if you're a dyed-in-the-wool free trader, and look, there are lots of them still in Europe, you'll just say that just shows we need to be friends and we have codependency and markets work. Yes, it also shows that when Europe could see China attempting to do something which it didn't want, which I believe, if you look at all the reports around it, was to effectively asset strip the firm and put them into a different vehicle, which would have been problematic for Europe in multiple dimensions we don't have time to discuss here now. When Europe said, right, we're putting our foot down and we're using, I think actually it's 1952 law rather than 72, not that that matters.
Even worse then.
Basically a wartime style appropriation. Yeah. Even when Europe presses the red button, it actually doesn't do anything because there's nothing behind the button. You don't own the entire upstream to downstream supply chain. Now, I want to pivot back just for a moment, just to say that doesn't mean that China has all the cards. There are still lots of areas in which the West, collectively, if they wanted to, could really squeeze China. The practical physical economy matters more than the financial economy. I have to absolutely make that clear in terms of a hierarchy, like a Maslow pyramid of what you really need. You don't need finance, you do need physical production. You don't need a bank, you do need a farm, at the most basic level. But that doesn't mean that the financial system couldn't be used against China if people wanted to do it, etc. So the West is not toothless, but it is having its teeth pulled out one by one, or they're going rotten one by one. And it's continuing to, both have the most appalling dental hygiene as a routine and eat all the wrong kinds of food. And it's just doing that continuously, as it's been doing for years. That said, America is talking about trying to get some false teeth done in typical Hollywood fashion, and and have a fantastic set of brilliant white teeth in its late 70s, as so many Hollywood stars do. And Europe is talking about doing the same thing, but so far is just looking at what the cost of getting Invisalign done or something like that. That's about as far as they've gone.
I mean, do you think that one problem is, and this might sound a little bit conspiratorial, but that the political class, and this is probably more true for the United States than it is for Europe, that they do not think they can tell the public what their strategy is, and kind of the kind of strategy we discussed here. So nothing conspiratorial on the part of the strategy, but to say, oh, people would not understand it, and people would not grasp what we're trying to attempt with the Western Hemisphere. So we cannot talk about the necessity to define it as our sphere of influence, and we have to say it's about the drug cartels, and it's because Milei is such a good friend of ours, and it's because Maduro is a very, very bad, no good person. Because the argument probably, which would be true, could be that the United States, they are not an imperial power, so even if they behave like an imperial power, even though they are building an empire in the Western Hemisphere, they cannot sell it to their own population, so they come up with all these quasi reasons that might still be part of it. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that this is all just a smokescreen, but they use like the minor reason to hide the major reason. Yet at the same time, and we can also discuss maybe a little bit where this is coming from, you have now this new trend in the United States where they try to build, I'm just using this term because I don't have a better one, when they try to build an empire that domestically you have this rise, as you described it at the beginning of the show, you have this neo-isolationism that is not just saying America first. I think the new slogan is now America only. So this will make this much more difficult. And kind of the same question about Russia when I'm China. Could I not just wait? Or is it on the Chinese end that they have such demographic problems and such problems in their financial sector that they cannot afford to wait and are therefore potentially more on a course of confrontation?
Wow, okay, a lot to unpack. Let me start with the Chinese one because that's what I heard last. They have been waiting, and that waiting has worked fantastically for them. As I said, the strategy they've employed has been brilliant. Does it contain logical flaws? Yes, because at the end of the day, everyone will put up tariffs. Everyone will push back eventually. Or you will end up with too much production for the entire world. But then, you run the entire world's industry at that point. So you can deal with the problems from a position of strength because you control everything. And if you ever manage to move across to controlling the financial system at the same time, well, then wonderful, you control the entire package, right? So patience has been what they've been using up until now. The reason why they're snarling so aggressively at Japan, which actually hasn't changed rhetoric, their policy stance actually hasn't changed. It's just that they've maybe made it vocal more than previously. I think China is looking to make it very clear that, okay, we are now a larger animal in this region, or a larger beast, excuse me, to use the correct terminology, a bigger beast. That's the right phrasing. A bigger beast here than we were previously. So we want to make it very, very clear to all the smaller beasts, like Japan, et cetera, that, this is our territory in a way that we didn't mark out quite in that way before. So I think that's more of the dynamic there. They're not losing their patience. They're attempting to just display how far they've come with a policy of patience. Remains to be seen how that plays out. In the US, look, there's a contradiction with everyone's system. There's a contradiction everywhere. I mean, Mao would have agreed, of course. He said, life was contradiction in all terms. I don't know how the US will ultimately resolve America first versus America alone. I don't know how they will be able to package what strategically they need to do in the Western Hemisphere with isolationism. I mean, it can be done, but it's logically rather inconsistent, and it certainly doesn't sell very well internationally. It's not going to be kind of an American values system that you get people, signing on to in other Western democracies in quite the same way. I mean, they can sign up for other reasons, and they may well do, but it's not the same thing as it was. I don't think that's actually the hardest of sells, because I think America has always been very good at spin. And I'm sure that there's some way to put together something that talks about the Americas rather than America, albeit, with very tight border control, which of course is, a central focus for this particular administration, that would still work. But it's an evolving it's an evolving process. And I think Venezuela will be absolutely the pivot point, as will the Panama Canal, where we still haven't seen that completely resolved yet. But expect movement probably on definitely one and maybe both, fairly imminently from what we're seeing in the press.
Do you think that one of the issues could be that due to historical developments and historical memory, that the Europeans in particular, but in parts also elements within the US administration, but also within the US public, that we have unlearned what was very often called the great game? Right? If you would ask Russia, why does it matter if you're a great power? I think they would not understand, or at least the leadership, they would not understand the question, because that is what a power is supposed to do. I would argue that maybe parts within the Chinese leadership would make the same argument. They say, well, that's a ridiculous question. As a country, as a nation, as however they define themselves, right? You want to take, as the Germans said, after 1870, you want to take your place in the sun. So this is a kind of the natural order of things, if you want. Whereas in Europe and the United States, there seemed to be a little bit this idea, is this at least so kind of as a subtone, if you want. Is it really necessary? Why do we have to be the world's superpower, right? Well, even in the European case, why do we have to be in competition with other nations? Can't we all be friends? Can't it not all just be determined by economic relations? Do you think that in a certain way there are different worlds that are inhabited by different mental worlds inhabited by different countries and different nations?
Certainly. Absolutely. I think in the American case, though, it's much easier for them to slip back into some form of manifold destiny. Sorry, manifest. It'd be manifold manifest destiny, because there are so many different ways in which that would ultimately need to be expressed. And when you have territory in the form of Hawaii, for example, and Alaska, and Guam, as an American territory, naturally you have to cast your eyes much, much further than you do. I mean, if you're just a continental power. I mean, Europe, of course, has got France, which has got, Indo-Pacific territory too. But that's very much the exception. The UK, for example, not that we're in Europe, but, we were until recently, technically we still control the Falklands, just off of Argentina. Do we talk about that? Is that part of our strategic conversation that, we need to project strength in South America? Not in the slightest. Not in the slightest. It was in the 80s. It isn't today, and we couldn't do it today if we had to. So having that territory itself is a necessary but not sufficient cause. America has more than sufficient. I think the conversation there is between whether they believe it's best done through economic statecraft and whether that's done through open markets and that free markets will make America great, which is what they used to believe. They very clearly don't anymore. But if they're going to go and are going the neo-mercantilist route, they will discover that you need a certain kind of military structure in order to make that work. So that will happen automatically for America. Europe, I mean, okay, as I said, with the exception of France, which does have that territory, far-flung territory, it tends to look inwards. It's no longer the outward-looking power that it was, and it's no longer a power in the way it was. I can see that you have tiny little embers of it left, but they're largely in the architecture and in the museums in Europe. I don't see any sign that they're in any strategic studies institutes. Or any serious policy circles arguing that Europe has a sphere of interest. They're saying that about Ukraine, for example. Ukraine is Europe's sphere of interest. Okay, so then what does that actually in practical terms mean? And that comes back to where we started the conversation. The hardline rejection of the US 28-point plan is to say that European forces will be placed in Ukraine. Europe will give Ukraine a solid defense guarantee. Europe will be the one stepping up. Which effectively, if you join the dots, it's not difficult to, from a Moscow perspective, says Europe's at war with Russia. If you say Ukraine will join NATO, European troops go into the ground in Ukraine. Europe both defends Ukraine and at the same time puts its own troops there. From a Russian perspective, that looks very much like war with Russia. And so if Europe says that's our sphere of interest, are they prepared to do that or are they not? I'm not in any way trying to say they should or shouldn't. That's not my job to do. But these are logical processes that you have to, understand when you think what will or won't be done on a more likely basis. And on that basis, it strikes me as Europe as an entity will say, well, no, actually, we won't do that. And that's why it hasn't happened so far.
I mean, without getting too much into hypotheticals, but I believe it's becoming more and more difficult to completely separate the domestic from the international. Now, if I would be Ukraine, even if I would be, again, as I said originally, if I would be Russia, wouldn't I be tempted, particularly if it would be Europeans, to call their bluff? I mean, if we look at the EU member states or broader Europe, if we include the UK and Norway, if you will, I mean, how many of the peoples of these nations would really be willing to fight in a war? I mean, this seems like an almost frivolous question in the light of everything that is happening, but I think it is an important question. I mean, there is currently a debate in Germany about reintroducing the draft, or kind of draft lottery, and the pushback from the public across the entire political spectrum is substantial. So even if there would be such, NATO Article 5 resembling guarantees from the Europeans, are they credible? I know this is a very hypothetical question, but I would still be curious to get your take on this. I know we're speculating here, but I'm not sure if this would be credible.
No, well, look, I think you hit the nail on the head, because there are so many different angles one can approach this from. From the physical side, upstream to downstream supply chains, the percentage of GDP being spent on the military, how that's being spent, the political structures that you put in place for command and control, et cetera, and all of them are problematic for Europe, all of them. But the key one is anyone actually willing to fight? Because while we will see a shift to drone technology, absolutely we will, and we will see a shift to automation in war, the same way that we have in factories, it's not here yet. Ukraine makes it very, very clear at the cutting edge. It hasn't happened yet. In the Middle East, we've seen, for example, the Israeli army, which was the most high-tech in the world, and attempted to try and address all these issues with technology, to turn around and say, no, we massively need to increase our manpower. That's going to be required. We need a much larger infantry than we thought we would have needed. So that's going to be the case for Europe too. And if Europe doesn't have a cohort of young people, because it will be young people doing it, who not just are available to do that, and that's a demographic argument, but who are willing to do that, which is on one hand, a cultural argument, and able to do that, which is a physical health argument. Do you have OCD and ADHD or depression or something? Are you actually able to get up and do the task? If the answer is no, you don't have the young people, culturally they don't want to do it, and physically they can't do it, it's not going to be done. It's as simple as that. And this is as old as the hills. You can be as sophisticated as you like, and we can bring econometrics into this argument. We can bring anything we want into it. But, the simple, rather crude truth over the long run of history is, from a Nietzschean perspective, you get societies and you rub them together, in terms of friction, and just see which ones produce a cohort which says, okay, when push comes to shove, this matters to me and I will do something about it, and ones that don't. And it doesn't mean that a society that can't do that fails completely. That's not what I'm saying. But it needs to be aware of that in terms of what it's actually doing. Because, as to use an old phrase from my hometown, you don't want to, your mouth doesn't want to be writing checks that your body can't cash, right? Because it's going to be painful.
And we see the first signs. This was a couple of days ago, where French general said on TV that France must be ready to it probably sounds better in the original French, but he said something to the meaning of that the French need to be ready or prepared to sacrifice their children. And once again, the pushback from the public, again across party lines, was tremendous. And I also cannot imagine, I don't want to stick to this topic too long, but as you said, I think this is so important. I just don't see, maybe the professional army, right? Not conscripts, but who would be willing to die for Keir Starmer's UK? I think that the numbers are probably very, very small. So once again, without being, I don't want to be frivolous here, but once the body bags keep coming home, I mean, how many would you need for the people to say this has to stop? I mean, in the United States, people say Vietnam, but I think even during Vietnam in the 60s and 70s, there was a different mindset. But if you look at Iraq, even that was difficult, and that was not a conscript army. So this strikes me as, the reason why I'm saying this is because you have all these debates now on social media about a peace plan and 28 points, or the European 15 points. But paper is very patient. But what's the meaning of the words on the paper is if then nobody can actually execute them. So to you, Michael, I can make many promises in writing. I can say, if you shall get ever attacked, I will defend you unto death. But the question is, will I really? I mean, this is the question you can ask. Say, is Ralph really going to do it, or is he just saying it? And I think the same thing is true here as well. And the other thing you said, again, I don't want to get too much off topic, but I think it is fundamentally important, is a lot of these conversations seem to be around moral questions. And I think when it comes to the morality of the war from Russia against Ukraine, I mean, nobody in their right mind says that this was a justified war. I know that I already see the comments that said, no, this was all in Minsk and self-defense. But usually, like, if a country invades the neighbor, it's pretty easy to say who was the aggressor in most cases, at least. But that being said, whatever the morals are, at some point you have to deal with the facts on the ground. And diplomatic notes that express how worried you are make no difference. You know what I mean? It's this kind of, we talk about morality, but at some point these conversations need to translate into a strategy, production, whatever it is, but they must translate into something more than just rhetoric.
Oh, I mean, of course.
Sorry, that took longer than I wanted it to take.
No, not at all. I mean, I heartily echo what you're saying. And if people don't understand this, and unfortunately, a lot of people in very high places don't understand this, clearly, very bad things happen as a consequence. I mean, you can say, and I have heard people say, well, look, we can just go to the other end of the spectrum. For example, we can just say, right, we're going to go nuclear. So everyone goes nuclear, then you have a nuclear standoff. The issue with that, and we could have a whole conversation about that, is, of course, then basically it's everything or nothing. So at each transgression, at each little kind of grey zone activity, for example, drones close Eindhoven Airport. World War III? No, we're not going to go to war over Eindhoven Airport. I have to sleep on the floor of an airport in Munich. World War III? No. That just inconveniences me. That's not going to happen. So therefore, you either have everything or nothing, and you can just do everything under that umbrella. So even that doesn't solve it. You have to have a full spectrum of force that you can display, from the conventional to the unconventional, to be able to say, look, these are the steps we will take depending on the situation. And this is a key point, and I think maybe a good point to wrap up, if I may, which is it's incredibly expensive to do that. And it's not just about money. If it were just about money, frankly, look, we can print money at the central bank, right? And we have done. But it's about far more than that. America is realizing that and is attempting to try and reshape its economy radically to address it in different ways, which are popular and unpopular in different places. Europe's talking about that a lot. We've had infinite plans being floated and acronyms, but it needs to really start to act fast. And if one of these plans goes through, the 28.1, the 24, the 20, whatever, if it looks like the one that we saw in the first draft, that decision will be on Europe imminently, and things will really have to get moving. And they could really start changing what we see in politics, in economics, and in markets.
As a last question, Michael, if you'd be a betting man, and I know that you have like a crystal ball hidden somewhere under your desk, but you've been quite prescient in the past with your predictions, and I recommend everyone to check out your LinkedIn profile, your profile at Rabobank, to follow you on X, where you publish your ideas and your thoughts, and particularly also to read your long-form papers. I think your X presence is phenomenal, but your long-form papers are even more insightful. So based on the work that you did in the past, if you look now, let's say 2, 3, 4, 5 years into the future, do you think things will get more complicated, more complex, and even harder to grasp for the near future, or can we hope for some form of relaxation in the field of international relations and the global economy?
No, it's all going to get much worse before it gets better. Purely because everything, as I said, is conflated in that what I think will happen very soon is that all those parts will come into play at once. So you'll have attempts to try and strike deals in different locations, which will de-escalate and escalate at the same time, because some issues are resolved, other new ones are then created. And particularly if we solve Europe, quote unquote, and solve is a very, silly way to describe it, but let's call it that, and we solve the Middle East, which is 10 times sillier to talk about there. That just shifts the focus to Asia, and there's a lot to be resolved in Asia. Okay, so that's one issue. But then we also have lots and lots of conflating issues all running through at exactly the same time. So buckle up, because 2026 is going to say to 2025, hold my beer.
Well, on that note, Michael, I hope you will remain our co-pilot for these stormy times and the stormy period of history. Michael Avery, thank you so much for coming on the Brussels Signal Horizon podcast.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.